This on?
All right. Good morning. Thank you for waking up this early, joining a quite technical session on why using MDT together with Config Manager. Wow. I have to say I'm very impressed. Despite all the parties last night, you're still filling out this room for some MDT stuff. That's good. I'm Johan. This is Michael. We will be your hosts for the next 75 minutes. We love questions, so at any given time, feel free to yell them out, and we'll try to repeat them and answer them. And we will also take questions through Twitter, but just make sure to actually tag them with the session code so we have a little chance of finding them in the MMS feed at least. So we won't be able to answer them all because the past sessions we had a few hundred tweets. But what we do afterwards is that we go over all these questions, make sure they are answered before you leave the conference. So that's why we have them. We have been doing deployment for a very, very long time. I've been doing it for about 21 years now, and Michael is older than I am, so he's been doing that even longer. My first official deployment training I did in my life was his class. BDD old something way back.
Yeah, 2.5, and I saw his name on the list, and my absolute first thought was like, there's only two reasons why he should be in my class. Either he's here to harass me, or he's going to steal the material and create his own lab.
Borrow, it's the word. Borrow, not stealing.
And it was the last one, but he was polite.
I was nice. All right. What MDT is, it's a solution accelerator. It's there to help you guys. It's more or less a deployment solution in itself because you can run it as such. You can use the light touch part to do OS deployment standalone if you don't have Config Manager. But in this session, we will focus on using Config Manager together with MDT and why that's a good idea. So all in all, MDT adds well over 100 OSD enhancements on top of the Config Manager platform. Does this mean you are required to use MDT to do OSD with config? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. Config Manager will do OS deployment on its own. But before you guys start to customize stuff, start to write code to do something in the Config Manager environment. Check if it's not already in MDT. Most likely it is, because the last version of MDT, 2010, has been downloaded for about 500,000 times, meaning they get pretty good feedback from customers out there what they need in an OSD environment for the enterprise. And that's what they are adding on top of Config Manager as well. And since they are a smaller team, they can add these changes more quickly. So we typically see 1 or 2 releases of MDT every year, and not so many releases of Config Manager every year. It's more like every decade.
5, 6.
Sort of. Mm-hmm. Now, there will be service packs and stuff, but you get the idea. Of these 100+ enhancements, what we like the most is the entire framework for doing dynamic deployments. Typically in Config Manager, when you start to create sequences, they become quite statically. But with MDT, we can have dynamic settings living outside the sequences, and we can feed them in during deployment. So we can have a single sequence that behaves very differently depending on what hardware I deploy to, what subnet I'm in, what department I belong to, etc. We can create all these rules that make the sequence behave differently. So we don't need 25 sequences just because we have a bunch of different types of configurations that we want. We also get a deployment database. A database specifically built to store OSD-related settings. Because, quite frankly, Config Manager doesn't have one. I know you can create collection variables, you can do it on the resource as well, and you can store information there. But there is no specific table for it. And the beauty of this database is also, as we're going to show you today, you can customize this. You are encouraged to customize this. You can add your own tables, your own views, your own stored procedures, something you're not allowed to do with the config manager database. You can have this deployment database in turn reach out to other systems that you have in your environment to retrieve settings that you use for deployment. For example, it's not uncommon that you already have a machine register somewhere. When you buy machines, you register them in a database, or asset management, or inventory system. You can have this database at deployment time reach out and get that machine name and use it as part of your config manager deployment. You also get an entire development framework. So before writing that 400 line of script, and I've seen this, to deal with regional settings. Look in the MDT box, it's already in there. And you enable it by one line in a text file. And that's quicker than writing a bunch of scripts and codes. Config Manager by itself, it's built for not asking you things. It's built to be fully automated, every deployment that you do. That's why it was called basically zero touch in the beginning, back in 2003 with the feature pack and stuff. But some customers, they want to be able to actually input something. They want to have the technician, or even as scary as it sounds, the end user, selecting things. And MDT adds that as well. They give you a front end that you can use together with Config Manager to allow for additional input, select application, select language, select image, select settings. But we will come back to that later today. So, let's switch. Can I have number 4, please?
Number 4,
yes.
Coming up.
And
Yes.
making sure you are keeping.
Okay, so I'm.
Yes. Yeah, you're looking at the feed. That's
Okay.
good. That's good. This is my config manager server. So I will kick off the config manager console. This console I have extended with MDT. And that part is very tricky because you need to install MDT. That's a 22 meg MSI that you download. And you need to run the integration script, which is in the start menu. And if you have actually opened the console once, it will know all the settings already. So let me do this. And let me show you the. Here we go. This is what it looks like when I have installed it. This is what it would look like these will be cleared if I haven't installed it. So just start the integration, kick off, and then when you start the console, you will start to see things you don't have by default in Config Manager. For example, steps to create sequences named MDT. That's just template. It's still a Config Manager sequence. But when I open a sequence that I've created using that template, you will see that that's quite larger, quite more actions than you have in your normal Config Manager sequence. But don't worry, all these will not run. They are based on conditions. For example, I did a session on Tuesday, we talked about BitLocker. There is a BitLocker action. It's disabled by default, but even if I enable it, it doesn't help because you have conditions associated with that step. These must be fulfilled as well. So that's why MDT comes in play when you have the settings file. So you always have a settings file, which Michael later is going to go into great details about. And it's not in that folder. And in this init files, you have rules that will determine how the sequence will behave. And in this case, I have configured, well, this value is supposed to be set to yes. And as you see, the condition in the sequence For this to run, it has to be not yes, meaning it won't run it. And now I can have, for example, all right, all my laptops, bang, set that value to yes. For all desktops, skip it. I can just add that in single lines in the text file, and the sequence will now change behavior. I can do it model by model, MAC address by MAC address, site by site, combination and all that. Pretty cool stuff. We can also have lists of applications that we can feed into the sequence. We don't have to put them in here, select them statically, and create lists in the sequence. We can have the lists outside. So I can have 3 application lists because I belong to 3 groups or 3 roles in the MDT database. So I can have 10 applications being installed because I belong to a site, 2 more because I have a specific hardware, 3 more because I belong to a specific department. And all these lists combines and feeds into the sequence, and then the sequence will happily install them in that order.
I got a question for you, because this is something that customer tends to ask me, and that is, there's so many steps in this sequence. I'm thinking of rationalize and making it faster by removing all the steps unneeded. I know what I answer. What will you answer in that case?
No.
Correct. So don't even try to do that, because some of the steps are depending on other steps.
There is no need. The steps that runs, they are needed, and the other are condition-based. For example, the sequence will not run sysprep and capture this image unless you tell it to, unless you set the condition that says, all right, go ahead and do capture. For normal deployment, you wouldn't, so you set it to no. That's why I had it to no. It's a normal build. But I can also do other magic. If you look when you're adding stuff to the sequence, you will see there is an MDT-specific menu where you can add items not belonging to the normal config manager sequence. So for example, you can install language packs directly that you add into the config manager console. You can even run PowerShell script directly. They have their own host provider for this as part of the sequence. You just specify the PowerShell script and run. You do not need to set execution policy. You do not need to call PowerShell exe, yada, yada, and all that. You have this fellow adding stuff. I would like them to rename it to adding stuff.
Yeah, that's going to be tricky.
So how do you add, for example, say that you want the Telnet client on your enterprise image, because it's very good for troubleshooting. Telnet, IP address, port, great. How do I add it? Well, a number of ways. I can add a command line that will run dism and inject it. I can hack the unattended XML file open, because the sequence is using an unattended XML file. In fact, this is what happens when we start a deployment. One, gather is happening. This operation is reading this text file and stores all that in memory. Then, a bit later in the process, there is a configure step that happens. You will see this in the sequence. It's one of the actions. And this action will do 2 things for you. One, it will copy the unattended template in the settings package to the local drive. Not in that folder, but subfolder. And then it will update. That's a new word. I just invented it. It will update the local unattended XML file with the settings that was retrieved through gather. So normally you don't have to do things in the unattended XML file. You can do it in the rules instead. If I set the compute name to be PC81, that information will be gathered here and later injected dynamically into the XML file. And then, of course, setup or the other component, OSD apply, it's depending on the package in config manager, will run with that now updated unattended XML file. So normally you should not edit that file. You should do that in rules instead. But going back to the telnet client, I could add that into the unattended XML. But I can also simply add it here. I can say install, roles and features, and I simply select it. Here we go, telnet client. Or what if this is not the client deployment? This is a server deployment. You want to have SNMP maybe, or multipath I/O, or any of the other stuff that might be useful on a server.
And then, of course, you can go into options, and then you can set conditions.
Yes.
It should only be installed in case of.
If this is an HP, go ahead and do this. This is a laptop, don't do this. So you have a lot of goodies available as actions in here. This one is particularly cool. But do we need this in Config Manager 012 for OSD? May not. The beauty of MDT 2012, it's both for 2007 and Config Manager 2012. 2012 MDT works with both of them. So this is quite useful if you still are running on 2007. 2012, as you've probably seen this week, you can right-click an image on the server and inject updates offline on that image, pulled directly from your software update point. You do not have to do a build and capture anymore. You can service it offline as long as it's Microsoft updates. But speaking of rules, may I have the
PowerPoint?
Yes.
Flipping over to PowerPoint.
Beautiful. The central place for doing OS deployment with Config Manager and MDT together is this simple text file. You can start storing things in this text file if you want to, but you can also, as I said this morning, configure it to reach out to other systems. But before we allow you to reach out, let's
demo.
Bend the rules.
Yes. So did I have number 3?
You're number 3.
And you're number 4.
I gave you micro number 1. That was nice of me.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
So if you look in this text file, this is custom settings.ini. Can everybody see this? Okay. So it's pretty easy. Let's enlarge that. It starts by reading. What happens is that we run the gather script, as Johan told you. The gather script will read this file, and it's looking for something called settings. In settings, it's going to find something called priority. And in this case, it's going to find default, which is a default value. And it's also going to find another value. I invented that. It doesn't exist. It's called by ISVM or SVM. And then it's going to add a property. The property in this case is my custom property. You can add whatever properties you like to be used in different combinations for various reasons. So this is going to read default and by SVM. And in this case, it's going to read this. And when it's done, it's going to read this one. And here it becomes funny. By SVM doesn't exist. I invented that. Subsection equals SVM dash percent SVM percent. And that is a value that we get from the gather script. So that is either going to be true or false. If it's true, it's going to point the subsection and read the next one. In this case, it's going to read this. And if that is true, it's going to add a package to be installed. And that package is just a plain VB script that configures the machine to be optimized for virtualized environment. So I don't really like to have a task sequence with different rules and modifications, or having different task sequences, or even multiple images. I don't like that. I like this one. If I deploy the machine virtualized, it's going to be optimized for virtualized environment. Now, when you do all this stuff and you play around, one of the things that you might wonder is that how do you test this? Well, if you go to a customer that haven't done this, they test it, of course, by installing a machine. Takes an hour or more. So how many machines can you test per day? A couple. And then it's going to be a couple of days more, and a week, and a month. And then you're 6 months into it, and it still doesn't work. We don't really have the time, even if I work as a consultant, and I charge by the hour. It's just very boring to watch Windows being installed. It's fun.
It's not.
It's fun for the first time, and the second time, and maybe the third time, then it just becomes boring. So you need to be able to test this. And here's how you test it.
Before you kick off, freeze. You might have seen this week that you can do application simulations, deployment of applications simulated in the config manager console. You can create these simulation jobs. We can do that with OSD as well. We can simulate the full deployment. What if I would deploy this machine with this setting without actually doing it?
So in this case, number one is to clean up the mini-NT folder, because when you have run the script, it's going to store all the variables in that folder. So if you run it again with a modification, it's not really 100% sure that modification will show up. So you need to clean out that folder. And then I run the VB script that does the gather. And that location is my source package folder in my configuration manager server if I added a Microsoft Deployment Toolkit. And then I, of course, point to an ini file. And that's the location of the custom settings.ini file. In this case, I have a %1 just to be able to do demos of different files. And then I just run the CM trace to verify this. So if we do like this, test custom settings.ini, it will execute that and run that. Stuff happening. But if you go into this and see what happens here, you can see it's gathering a lot of information. It's discovering that we are running a virtual machine. We have the following amount of memory. Yada, yada, yada. We go down. We can see here. It's a virtual machine. Runs Hyper-V, I guess. The argument. And here you can see it's picking up the using from settings, rule priority default, and bias VM. If we go down, you can also see this. Here's where the magic sauce is. Using from default, processing bias VM, and as you remember, hopefully, I had a section called subsection is VM true, which means it's going to process that section, and now it's adding packages 001, which is the VDI configure package I have, which will end up being installed. So as long as that package name is correct, it will be installed by the task sequence.
Only if it's a VM.
Only if it's a VM.
Yes.
So this is how it works. Now, let's see what you can really do with this. Well, here's a plain vanilla file. Nothing fancy, because that's pretty much the way it looks from the beginning. But here we have the marvelous discussion of what is the rules for naming computers. John's PC.
5.
Or
John's new PC 5.
Yeah. So some customers say, well, let's just pick the serial number. Is that easy? Yeah, I can do a script for that. Or we can just say that OSD computer is going to be PC dash and the 7 most left part of the serial number. And here's another thing you can see, and this is not really a useful thing, but you can see that I've created another property called mic name. And mic name is equal to OSD computer name, which means that you can take different variables and combine them into another variable, which you can use for different purposes. So if you want to combine architecture, memory, site code into one, then you have one new variable that you can use either in your task sequences or using by subsection.
So before start to write scripts, look if the feature you're looking for is not in there already. And before you run that, sir,
yes,
would you be so kind to show the audience where to find the list of all available stuff?
The properties.
Yes.
It's very well hidden. You need to open the deployment workbench, and then you need to use something called help.
Oh, you mean documentation?
Yeah, the documentation.
We never need or read docs.
No, and then we can just, I don't know, search for IP address, for instance. Yeah, here's IP address. Something called property definition. I guess we have a list of property definitions that you can use here.
So before writing your own components, check if what you're looking for is on that list before start to write that.
One thing that is very important is that this list contains all the variables we can use. Some of them works only with light touch. Some of them only works with zero touch. So, and that's really hard to understand too, right? User locale, for instance, it says here, it applies to both light touch and zero touch. So some of them doesn't make sense to use in configuration management because they're used in other ways. Okay, so let's run this. Demo 2. Execute this one. It's picking up. Yep, there you go. Here's the computer name. The computer name is now set to this. Now we could combine this in other ways. Maybe we want to have something like this. This happens from time to time. We would like all the laptops to be named something, and I would like all the desktops to be named something. Okay, so here we are. Sorry. By laptop type and by desktop type is invented by us. Doesn't exist. We also have a bunny status. Not going to explain that. That's the last MMS. If you check here, it says, sorry about that, the default is use PC, write serial number, blah, 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 blah. And then we have by laptop type, and here we say if it's a laptop, then it shouldn't be PC, it should be LT for laptop.
And you can, for example, add an OU in there as well, so that laptops will be joined and added to a specific OU and desktops to another.
Yeah. And then you can combine that with different locations. So if that is the location, then it should be named the following things. What we try to do is that whenever we deploy operating systems, there are a couple of questions that needs to be answered. If they can be created in any rule form, then we try to do that. That means that the whomever going to deploy that machine needs to answer less questions. If they only need to answer one question, like, would you like to deploy? It's yes and no. It's not that hard. Most likely they will do it right. If they have 400 questions to answer, it will be wrong.
So before kicking off the, how would you go about extending this if you wanted to?
It can be extended in different ways. Either you can extend it locally, and that is something called user exit script. Or you can extend it externally, and that's another story, and you're going to cover that later on, I know. Here's the location thing, and I'm going to show you how to do that with something called a user exit script. So here is a user exit. Priority, run the set model alias setting, here is. And I would like you to jump out, run this VB script, and return the information from that VB script. So I can use that as a model alias. And I'm going to run this first. It's demo number 7, so you can see how it looks like. Close that one. 7.ini. And if you watch carefully, you will see that it's going to jump out and run a VB script. There it goes. So if we go in here and look in the package, in the scripts, we have something called the model alias exit VB script. I'm going to edit this. And what this does is very simple. It has a function called user exit. This is the header of it. And then we steal some variables from with MDT because we have them available. And then we start asking WMI queries. We usually select case. So if it's a Dell computer, then we remove these spaces. If it's a HP, we do that. If it's a Lenovo, well, then we can create things like, if it's a Lenovo and the whatever version they have, you want to translate that into something readable, well, then you can have it in something readable. In this case, it's doing something really nice. It's actually removing the last 3 digits, which is the unique build of that particular Lenovo machine. I only need the 4 first, right? Because that's the actual model. So I will remove that.
You're basically normalizing the models.
Yes. And here's a nice thing. We are running something called Windows 8 Server, or Windows Server 2012. Fun to say that. And if I want to install integration components for that particular virtualization platform, MDT 2012 today doesn't recognize if you run the beta version of Windows Server 8. I added that. It was very, very tricky. There you go. Because if I use make and model, it's going to be virtual machine from a company called Microsoft Corporation. It doesn't matter what kind of virtual machine it is, because you can't see that. By reading the BIOS, it gives me that information. In that case, I can translate that into, it's a Hyper-V 3 build 8250. Now, when I run this, I will be able to use that information, as you can see. It's picking up that I'm running that particular version of Hyper-V, and in that case, it should install that particular integration components. So I can modify whatever I need to by adding things. Here's another strange, and you shouldn't do this. This is just for the fun of it. Here's a insane thing. Here's a massive amount of user exits. Every user exit components is in that file. It discovers BIOS version, model alias, the name of the disk drive, the name of the CPU, and now you can do insane stuff. Because I can have CPU as a priority, which means that I can add the CPU there. So if I install a machine with that particular CPU, then the home page should go to support.intel.com, and you should also install that particular package because we need some kind of acceleration application. So you can pick whatever you like. And does it take so long time to run this? No, it doesn't. It's pretty fast. There you go. And it's picking out all kinds of information. And obviously this just happens to be that particular processor for some reason. So now it's going to install the Super Intel Performance application because I'm running that particular CPU. That is what we try to do as much as you can to make deployment be a bit more dynamic instead of having a massive amount of test sequences.
So what we just did, we combined two demos into one, so that's that, and then, yep.
There you go.
What we also can do is have this ini file reaching out to a database to store the same type of information. The ini file is very useful to store generic rules. But if you have specific rules, for example, on a per machine basis, it's not that fun to add that in the custom settings ini file. I mean, you could start typing in all your MAC address in that ini file. And that's okay if you have like 3 computers. But if you have 3,000, a text file is probably not the best place to store computer-specific info. A database is much better to store that info. So, next.
You're being picky.
Yes.
Of course you can do that in a text file.
Yeah, I could do that in a text file.
Just need a very fast version of Notepad.
All right. So, when you install the workbench, there will be an advanced node or advanced configuration node. There you have a database. By default, it's empty, but you can right-click and create one. And then it will create a new database. And I recommend that you actually have this on the same SQL server as config manager and as the same instance. Because having that makes it very easy to have this database reach out into config manager and read stuff when needed. And you do not need to be worried about this putting another load on your config manager server. This database contains, by default, 10 tables. It normally has like 10 records in each, or entries per machine that you add. And it's only used when you actually deploy a machine. If you start to monitor performance, you won't even see that that database is running on that SQL host. Because when this database does one query, config manager will do 25,000. That's the balance. All right, so you create the database, and once you create the database, you can start pour content in. So I can start adding in machines here. So I can add a machine for Mike. So Mike's PC.
Do I get my own PC?
You can borrow mine.
Oh, thank you.
Mike's PC. And I need to identify Mike's PC one way or another. And it supports 4 identifiers. The most commonly used one of these two, any of these two. So either by serial number or by MAC address. So I know that Mike has this serial number. And then I can start to add in information about Mike's PC. So I can start fill in, for example, the machine name, PC74. And when I deploy a machine, the ini file will reach out into the database, read this information, find out that this is a machine with this serial number. It should have the following computer name. And as you can see, you have a bunch of settings that you can apply. But you can also group settings together. That is called roles. So I can create a role, geeks. Mike's a geek.
Yep.
And in that role, I can have, for example, all right, if you belong to the geek department, your organization name should be geeks, and the OU in Active Directory should be geeks, and of course the domain. Like that. We can start adding in apps. Applications, the new application model applications in Config Manager. So I can go add applications. And I have to specify the application name. 2012, that's a new Office version.
Yeah, I haven't seen that. Played with it a lot.
Whoa.
Nice it. Works perfectly fine.
The trick is to name it correctly. It has to have the name of the app in Config Manager, otherwise it won't find it. So I can start adding in applications here that I want the geek role to have. And as you can see, I can sort them upside down in the installation order of things. So I'm creating lists of apps. If you have legacy packages that you have migrated over from 07, or if you're still using 07, well, it's called packages. So now you have to specify the packages like Mike did in his demo with the package ID and the program name for that package. Did you have a VPN client or something? I don't remember.
Yeah, I do.
So it gets to a VPN client as well. So this role, geeks, is just now a group of settings. And I can now take that role and associate that with Mike's PC. So a PC can have one or more roles. You can even have roles in roles if you like, but I don't recommend nest them, but you can. But this allows you to very quickly assign standard-based settings to machines. You can do the same thing for locations. You can add a new location that's saying that, all right, here in Vegas, machines have the following default gateway. All right? And if I deploy a machine on this subnet, well, we should have, for example, any of these regional settings. So we set the UI language to English, assuming I have the movie pack in my image already, the language pack.
Is there any easy way to get that to automatically populate the Active Directory?
The question was, is it easy to populate this from Active Directory? Well, yes and no. I will show you a web service later that will allow you to do things like that.
Another good and valid question would be, let's say that you do have everything in an Excel spreadsheet and it's 10,000 machines. Well, is it possible to manipulate the database without using this interface? Absolutely. There are PowerShell scripts. So since we can script into the database, either using VB or using PowerShell, I think Nias recently did a PowerShell provider for this. You can read data from wherever you like and put it in the database, if you want to.
And you can combine. You don't have to put data in the database if you don't have to. You can have one section in the file reaching out to database to find information. But you can have another section in the same ini file reaching out through a web service into Active Directory directly and read the information on the fly. I will show you a web service later that will reading out the available OUs from the live Active Directory and build me a list of those so I can select from them, rather than storing them statically in a database that now needs to be maintained. So we can combine all these resources at deployment time. So we don't need to double store them. I would rather have the database reach out to get the information we needed, or the ini file reach out and get the information we needed. I can also do this on make and model. So I can do Hewlett-Packard, make, that's the vendor. And if I have an HP EliteBook 8540W, which I do, I can say, all right, for this particular model in my environment, I would like the screen resolution to be the following. Or whatever that is I want to have. And then I can add other models with different settings. And I can add different applications, different packages that will only be installed because of this model. How does conflict happen? That's a very good question. Let me show you. Here I have an ini file which is using the database. So you can see I have 3 sections in my ini file that is reading different tables, in fact, different views in the database. This is the code required to call a database. But up here, Michael mentioned priorities. This is the order in which I'm reading those settings. So if I have a conflict, in this case, it means that if the settings is done here, it will be used, because most of the MDT values and the config manager properties, it's the first writer wins. You can change that. You can override that later, but that's the default behavior. So as long as you get the order right, you're good. And it is, for example, if, as you can see, I have a default section where I specify the OU for my machines, where to store them in the Active Directory. But you can see that is last. That means is any of the other stuff, it's coming from the database, it's setting the OU, that will be used. But if it doesn't set anything from the database, if it doesn't use any of the previous sections, it will actually fall back and use this one instead. So it's nice to provide a sort of a ground zero where you can have these settings available.
And the easiest way to test this is to run the CDI gather script, because that will also do the database query, and you will get the result into the BDD log file, and you can see the result of that.
It's fun that you mentioned it, because I happen to have
Amazingly,
a client with an MDT folder, with the scripts, with a gather DB file. I wonder what that one does. It runs the gather script with the init file I just showed you, and as you can see, it's reaching out into the database, looking for things, but in this case, it didn't return much. You can actually see that record from SQL was 0. Well, this is because this machine has a MAC address, of course, of the following. And by the way, Zoomit is the utility that we use so that the people in the cheap seats back there can see as well. But this is my identifier for this machine. So I need to add that to my database. So I will try to remember this one, 0A74, help me here, Michael.
Why don't you use copy?
You mean copy and paste? So I'll go to Mike's machine. I will change the identifier. Was it 0A?
Can't remember, I'm getting too old.
Is that right, ladies and gentlemen? I think it's right. We'll see. I think it's right. We'll try again. What can possibly go wrong in a live demo? I don't know if you saw it, but it was actually flashing by here. You will see a select query being done. One more. Here we go. It runs select from where MAC address is this. It got one record back here, and eventually it actually set the computer name to that from the database. So as you can see, we can very quickly test and see, did I get stuff right in the database? Without having to wait an hour to deployment, just realize, typo, wrong MAC address, something like that. So this is also what MDT brings to you. You can also extend the database and add, for example, store procedures. So a good way of doing that is, as it happens to be, I have one. This is a normal store procedure in SQL. This one I'm using for generate computer names. And it will generate computer names based upon a prefix and a sequence number. And it will use the database to keep track of names it already handed out to you. So how do I configure MDT to use a stored procedure? Very complicated. You need to open Notepad and the init file, and you need to tell it to go ahead and execute the stored procedure. This stored procedure you can download from my blog as well. It's Deployment Research, where we also provide all the sample files, including Mike's blog, which is the obvious deploymentbunny.com. I'm not kidding. That's the name.
No, you're not.
So, but we just want to show you that there are so many ways that you can extend this to have the system and the database in this case to do more things for you. But how fun is it to give this interface to help desk? To give them the workbench?
And even, do you really want them to RDP into your configuration manager server?
Well, they could install this on their normal workstation and the config manager console and Windows Ike if they want to do sequences, but there are better ways.
Yes, we do have a friend. His name is Mike. And
Koster.
He doesn't spell Mike as Mike. That's another story. And he has done a MDT web frontend for many years, and now version number 2 is coming out.
The beta was released the day before yesterday. It's available on Codeplex. It's a web portal to the database.
Yes, and it does have some really nice features.
Aren't you supposed to demo that?
Yes, but I need to click on number 3 that will enable my screen so they can see this. So the MDT web frontend, and this is a beta version. 4 a.m. in the morning, it didn't work at all. 5 a.m. it started to work. So there are room for improvements. But basically what we can do here is that we can create computers. So here is the description of Mike's box that has a serial number of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 0. I remember that. And now I have Mike's box, and we can edit Mike's box. Sorry, not edit. What we can do is that we can go to details. And on details, we can see things, and of course we can go to, hopefully, settings. And you get all these settings that Johan showed you. This is just another color. But the thing is, what we can do is that we can limit the space that the technician can see. So we can say, he's not supposed to see all this stuff. I mean, he's a techie somewhere, right? He doesn't know what. Changing the OS disk index to 4. No, don't do that. No, please don't. Just no. So what you can do is that, number 1, you can, of course, edit this. And this will give you, in some locations, Dropboxes. You can build your own Dropboxes. So here's a good thing. Let's say that we don't care about that, but what we care about is the home page. Or maybe, no, the backup share. For some reason, we would like the techie to be able to pick and choose by 3 different locations. I don't want him to type in. So what we can create is that I can create a list and say, when you select backup share, you're not allowed to type anything. Here's the 3 different locations you can pick and choose from. So it's not just adding the capability of a web page, it's also adding the capability of showing people only the things they need and presented in a way that they don't need to know all the information. You can, for instance, pick and choose by 2 different home pages, or you can pick and choose by 3 different languages, because that's the only languages we use. Don't pick Chinese. We don't have any Chinese at the company, and it's really hard to troubleshoot a machine with Chinese. I've done that. It's very tricky.
You have to have an English side by side and
just compare, you know. Is that okay or cancel? I have no clue. Try one of them. Excuse me. So this is what you can do. So you can limit this space. Of course, we can do all things like picking your roles. That's basic PC, and I can pick applications and packages, and I can even type in who's going to be the local admin. Maybe we don't like them to type in the local admin. They should pick the admin from a list. It's either workstation administrator from that location or workstation administrator from that location. You can't type in the user's name. Oh, but he wants to be a local admin. Yeah, and I want a new car, and I can't get one either. So That's another story. You can also, then you can define this by tech level 3, for instance. So if I go into tech level 3, here I can define that these are the only categories they will be allowed to use. So if this techie goes into the web page, this is the only stuff he can modify because he can't see anything else. Well, this is already made packages, and you can pick your own category and say, well, you know, he's also allowed to see BitLocker, so let's add BitLocker to that. I'm going to add that. In that case, he's also going to see BitLocker. But maybe you don't want to have, you know, all the stuff in BitLocker. He's only supposed to be choosing the with or without TPM. Well, you can create your own categories, of course. So if you go to the administration, you have categories. Here's all the categories that are built in from the beginning. And then, of course, you can create your own. Demo. And then you can define whatever column it should be. So I can say, well, here's home page. Web portal. We don't use the word homepage in our company. We use the word web portal. It's very important for the techie to use the same language as the rest of us. Should it be text? Well, it could be yes or no, or it could be one of these. And this you can also create. So I can create a list of those specific web pages he can choose. So what web page would you like to have as your home page? You can either have, I don't know, MSN or
Bing.
Bing.
Pick one.
Can I have another one? No, that's the only thing I have in my list. You can pick between those. Thank you and goodbye. So it's very easy to do this, and this means you can delegate certain technicians to be a part of deployment without being the full-blown administrator that can do whatever they like. We do have a lot of customers using this. It tends to work very nicely after you installed it and configure it. And it's not that hard.
And we got an email from Mike yesterday. This is the first beta of version 2 that he put out on Coplex, as I said, the day before yesterday. He really wants feedback. So please give him that. He's doing a lot of work for the community, and whatever you can do to help, and it will be gratefully appreciated. So
yes. With that,
back to slides.
Back to slides.
It says demo.
The demo is done.
All right.
Let's do next thing.
Yeah.
Sorry?
Stop doing that. I'll smack you.
You always do that.
Another very powerful way is to use web services to reach and retrieve settings. And a web service is more or less code running on the server side. And since we have code running on the server side, we can do very cool things that is difficult to do if we only rely on client-side code, which we do, for example, when we call a user exit, when we call a database without a store procedure, and things like that.
And it's much more secure.
It's much easier to secure it. And also, imagine you have a distributed environment. Give me my demo screen.
Demo screen.
No. Switch. I can't do demos first.
Oh, sorry.
Has to be in the right order.
Yes, I know it needs to be.
I'm a control freak.
Yeah, I know.
Who would know?
That I know.
So I will now demonstrate to you my extreme Microsoft Paint skills. So I'm not kidding. So imagine you have two sites like this. These sites are connected with a, for the sake of it, 4 megabit WAN link. In the central site, or the central headquarters site, you have the database. So you have a server. This is a server, big server. And this is a red database. And every database is supposed to have, I've seen this.
You ever heard the expression that you should have the the right
Or-
tool for the right job. Ever heard of Visio?
Microsoft Paint is excellent. So, if I have a client now, that's not a client.
No, that's another site.
This is a client. Imagine you have many sites, but I just drawn two for you. So you have a central database. This database holds all the information. So what will happen now when the client connects? Well, the client will connect to the database. That database, in turn, will hopefully return something back to the client. Now, what protocol is being used? It's named pipes. Is that a very new protocol? No, it's a very old protocol. Oh, even almost as old as you.
Thank you so much.
I'm getting there as well. I'm turning 40 next year, so. It's using named pipes. And this works fine if that really is a 4 megabit WAN link. And it works fine if you have reasonable response times, meaning for hopefully on average, less than this. But what happens if this 4 megabit line is a 0.4 megabit line? What happens if that WAN link or those response times are no longer that, but they are starting to get in this range, really high latency? Will this work? No. I know you can increase connection timeout for the database. Will it help? No. You're toast. You have two options. You either start replicating databases, that's fun, not. Or you change protocol. You create a web service up here. Let's make that greenish. Whoa. That web service talks to the database, but you talk to the web service. So now you're switching from named pipes to HTTP. You will be used about 10% of the bandwidth to do the same database query. It's very reliable on slow links. It's very reliable on high latency. And since we are running code on the server, it's very easy to secure. So how difficult is it to configure MDT to call a web service? It's very tricky. Hold your horses.
Yeah, we used to have a 3-day training course on this.
Yes.
Used to.
It will actually take me longer time to find a file than to do the work.
Mm-hmm.
This is how you call it. You add a line with a link to the service. If the service takes parameters, in this case it does, this is a service that will move the object in Active Directory from one OU to another. That's it. And you can download ready-made web services from Codeplex. Same coster. This is where you can download some 150 plus ready-made services that works with Config Manager and also MDT 2012 Light Touch, most of them. They are divided into a few different areas. So for example, it will have calls for the MDT database, calls for Config Manager, calls for Active Directory. And let me just show you how the Active Directory one looks like. These are ready-made functions. I saw a question in the feed earlier. How can I retrieve groups from Active Directory? Well, guess what? Ready-made services to read groups out of Active Directory live and use whatever is returned as our settings, as our rules. If group equals, then this. Things like that. You can also combine this with creating web services that, for example, give me a list of available OUs. And then we can borrow the Light Touch wizard and use with Config Manager. So when I go to a client, and when I start a deployment in WinPE, either way, I can have an HDA page connecting to these web services, and in this case, read out information about my machine. It was apparently Mike's, with that description. It will get the roles directly from the database, and it will give me the OUs live from Active Directory. This is not static information put in the HDA. It's an HDA calling a web service, reaching out to Active Directory, returning something, and I'm using that as part of my deployment. Again, very powerful stuff, and you get that framework to do this stuff when you integrate with MDT. But you can take this one step further. In MDT 2012, Microsoft revamped the UDI component. The UDI is a user-driven installation, and it comes with a designer that allows you to create your own front ends. And when you open it, you open a text file called the default is UDI Wizard, but it can be named anything. You can see it supports all scenarios now in Config Manager. The previous version didn't. And it works, as I said, both with 2007 and Config Manager 2012. So if I, for example, open the first pages, you can see there is a ready-made BitLocker page that you can enable and use to allow someone to specify PIN when BitLocker is enabled when they deploy a machine. There is a page for when you are, for example, start a deployment of bare metals. All right, what image, what volume to go to. You can do when you're replacing machines. Maybe you can't do a network-based replace at the branch office. Well, if I'm replacing Mike's machine, I can take my USB drive, connect it to Mike's machine, I run the backup, I go to my new machine, and I run the restore. So I can have it prompt for me to restore backups from old to new machines, use empty style backups. I can have pre-flight checks. I can do tests. Is my machine running on power? Am I on a wired network? If not, abort. And you can add your own checks. Am I using a supported model of a machine? Yes or no?
Are you on a supported network where we have the deployment capabilities?
Exactly. I can specify information about the machine. Just another way to specify, in this case, the computer name and domain and OU. Just a ready-made wizard rather than an HDA.
And the UDI wizard also consumes variables.
Yes. It also reads properties, so if you want to pre-populate any of these values, you can do that too. This is a cool one. You probably learned this week that you can target application deployments to users. Well, we can actually, when we start a deployment, we can tell it who is going to be the primary user of this machine, so that applications that are targeted to that user is automatically installed as well without that user actually having to log on to the machine like you would in 07. We can also do language settings, of course, and we can provide lists of applications to select from, config manager applications. And everything that we have been showing you today, you can combine. So the short end story is, before start developing your own stuff, download these free tools. They are supported. They are well known, well used in the industry. You will be surprised how much information that is out there related to these solutions. So MDT, together with Config Manager, provides a really good story when we do OS deployment and, well, app deployment as well with Config Manager.
I would say this, for anyone that has been starting using MDT, the likeliness of that person will stop using it is very unlikely.
Yes.
I actually never been to that. As soon as you realize you can do all this stuff, then you start using it, and then you continue using it because you realize that, hey, this is just, giving me a lot of time back, and now I can spend time on something else.
Yes. So by that, we have 2 words left for you, and that is thank you.
Thank you.